see, basically a B scan will give you just a gross idea about the posterior segment, whether there's any detachment or vitreous hemorrhage, but it's not going to tell you about ERMs. So ERMs are something that it's very difficult to get image with the OCT. The newer OCTs, with the SS OCT, basically you're able to kind of get an image even in a dense cataract, but in a mature or intumescent white cataract, then it's very difficult to get the image. Then you'll have to do the test for the visual functions. You can use a potential acuity meter, or you can use even the ERG, multifocal ERG, to see if there is any defect as such. And most of these cases are taken up under guarded prognosis, and you would not like to implant a multifocal if you are not able to visualize the fundus, or if you're not able to see the macula with the OCT. So ERMs, fine ERMs will be very difficult to pick up if you're not able to do an OCT, get an OCT image. So you can see this is a dense cataract, almost grade 5, brownish. The patient is moving his head because he has little difficulty in breathing. He's quite. You can see the same parameters even for dense cataracts. You have to bury deep. And then when you chop, you split the nucleus. You have to go deeper down, stage-wise, until you can see that it splits. Because the fibers are quite tenacious in a brown cataract, leathery. I also asked my assistant to put wound on the saline on the wound so that the heat reduces. So I shift over to Phaco 2, and you can see even the dense cataract. You can see that the followability is good. Remove the quadrant. Split the nucleus. Then okay. If you find that you can see that the viscoat has evacuated because you're using high flow rate, the dense cataract, then you can stop and fill in more viscoat. So I think Dr. Abai's guide is that every minute you stop and then fill in viscoelastic in a dense cataract. So you can see the split, you get a good hold. And that's you can see that can you see the chamber stability even at the dense cataract? You never get occlusion because you can see that the fragment is always moving around the tip. And I'm using my chopper to kind of direct it and guide it. It kind of becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and gets eaten away. So you don't have any surge. And you can see that the wound also is very clear. Even in a dense cataract, you don't get a wound burn. His IOP is actually, he has Pickwickian, so his eye pressure is up. He's quite obese, truncal obesity, again, raises the intraocular pressure because they are not able to breathe when they lie down because the abdomen compresses the diaphragm, and then you can see the movement also. The eye is moving so much because he has difficulty in breathing. They can't lie down for long. So shall I another cornea? See, when you have shallowing because of this, and then you have a little bit of cortex there, then it is prudent to just put in the lens and remove the cortex, because if you're going and trying to remove the cortex in the periphery, there is no support, the posterior capsule just comes up. So I'm using an ultracert. So this is the ultracert. Again, the new ultracert actually is quite good because you can see that the leading haptic here also has folded well. And you have very controlled injection.
I think we have to compliment the assistant also.
And you can release.
He knows when to give visco, when to give saline before implanting the IOL. It's a.
And when you have visco, what happens is the followability further improves. So you can see that little bit of the feathery kind of a cortex. It's very easy to remove it when you have visco, because the visco increases the resistance to outflow and the followability. So we've been able to remove all the cortex there comfortably. Now, because I'm not afraid of the PC coming up suddenly, I can even angle it at 90 degrees, angle it completely, and then remove it.
I think one of the major.
Most of the viscoelastic.
I think one of the major improvements that has been made in the newer version of the ultracert was in the previous generation. Most of us used to feel that the leading haptic sometimes comes out unfolded and things. But I think because of the modifications or the three sort of grooves that they've made into the nozzle now, that I think is no longer a problem of the leading haptic coming out unfolded more often than not.
Another tip is, before closing, if you just smoothen out the incisions. I think this was demonstrated by Professor Chi from SNEC. She did ASOCTs, intra-op OCTs, and found that if you just do the smoothing of the wound, then the wound configuration is much better and you get a better seal. You can see the dense brown cataract, cornea is very clear, wound is clear. And I think we have come to the conclusion of the surgery is well in time. It's just, I think, 8 o'clock. If there are any questions, I can take them. I have to section out.
I think you have made all the surgery seem very, very simple, Dr. Ganesh. It's wonderful.
Surgery is simple when you know the technique and when you have a good machine like the Centurion.
So it's always...
Yeah, of course, it's always the man behind the machine, because you have to understand how to use the machine and understand the technology and use it to its maximum. See, here we have optimized the machine. The machine parameters, we are able to use the highest parameters because we have optimized the technique. And using different parameters for different aspects. Like for the Phaco chop, again, the ozil is not ideal because with the ozil you don't get occlusion. And for Phaco chop, you need an occlusion, you need to bury deep, you need to get a good vacuum seal. If the tip is moving sidewards, you will not get a good vacuum seal. So you have to use longitudinal Phaco. And burst mode is ideal because you can kind of titrate, and especially for harder cataracts, stepwise you can go deeper into the nucleus, get into the sweet spot before you initiate your chop. And then for the fragment removal, you can use ozil because when you're removing the fragment, you don't want any occlusion. You want the very good followability and maximum cavitation where you can, the whole nucleus kind of spins around, becomes smaller and gets evacuated through the tip. And this is possible with the ozil. So you don't have any occlusion, you don't have any surge, sudden surge. And the total energy used also is less when you use ozil, as you can see from the CD. So these are the advantages. And then small things like your incision, your wound configuration, and also the keeping the tip sidewards, using a 45-degree tip because that gives the largest surface area for the cavitation. And when you keep it at its side, then you have maximum exposure of the tip to the fragment and delivery of the cavitation energy so that the emulsification is faster and then the followability is good. So these are a few of the things: optimization, understanding the machine, and then using the machine to the best of their ability. And then when you keep an IOP of 20, what happens is the patients are very comfortable. When you suddenly increase the IOP in the eye, the ciliary body stretches. And when there's a ciliary body stretch, especially in the myopes, the chamber suddenly deepens, there's a ciliary body stretch, and you can actually, the patient winces and says, because they feel the pain. But that is not there when you use a low IOP. And even in cases of subluxated cataracts or complicated cataracts, when you have a low IOP and you still have a stable chamber, it is very useful. Even when you have a PCR, when you have a high IOP, there's a lot of infusion. The fluid is getting pushed into the vitreous. When you have a lower IOP, it is much more controlled, and you're able to, the PCR basically does not run off. And post-polar cataracts also, having a low IOP is useful. These are all situations, but even otherwise, there's no vascular compromise. When you're using an IOP of 20, the IOP is always maintained at 20. The chamber is maintained because of active fluidics. The fluid is pushed in whenever there is a necessity. So you don't have to keep your bottle height at 90 and push in fluid where the IOP goes up to like 60 millimeters, 50 millimeters, where these are all older patients over 70 years. They have a lot of vascular issues like diabetes, hypertensive, and you can have some amount of vascular compromise there. Even I think the incidence of cystoid macular edema may be lower if you have a lower IOP, because you don't have sudden deepening and shallowing of the chamber and then changes in the IOP and changes in the chamber depth. And these are all advantages of the active fluidics, and that's what I've been able to appreciate. And patients definitely are more comfortable, and first day the corneas are clearer. What I find is that we had a PCR, our average PCR was about 1.2 to 1.5%. Previously, before we got the Centurion, and after we got the Centurion, on an average, all three surgeons, we find that the PCR intra-op complication rate is less than 0.3%. So from nearly 1.5% to 0.3%, that's a huge shift in the intra-op complication rate. And that is one of the lowest complication rates, though we are using high parameters and we are doing all sorts of complicated cataracts. And that's where the technology helps.
A few questions, what about appointments for a very soft cataract? And the second one is continuing from where you left about the IOP. I would have been more comfortable with higher IOP with such a high flow rate and high vacuum. Like, do you really think that keeping at 20 would probably be right at 30, 40, and then what happened? I mean, patient comfort, because you've always been using a very high bottle height when you're actually using the gravity, because probably about more than 60 IOP. So, is it not a too low usage of an IOP?
No, you saw what we need is, it's not the IOP, it's the chamber stability, right? So if the chamber is stable at 20 or even at 15, then it's fine. It doesn't make a difference. What we want is chamber stability. And if you're able to achieve that at a low IOP and the patient is comfortable, then your fluid turnover also is lower. When you have a lower IOP, less fluid is being pushed into the eye. And on an average, I just use 15 cc per case. So the lesser the amount of fluid turnover, the lesser the incidence of endothelial damage, the lesser incidence of CME. So, and the chamber also is stable. See, what we want is chamber stability, and then you're able to work at a depth. There's no shallowing of the chamber, there's no surge. And that if you're able to achieve at 20 IOP, 20 IOP is normal IOP. Most of the patients, as a glaucoma specialist, you'll know that that is ideal. You don't want to raise IOP to 40 or 50 during your time, even if it's like 5 minutes. There is some amount of vascular compromise that happens, which you may not be able to measure, but it is probably subclinical. In a soft cataract, basically I have different techniques. I use a mechanical chop. So you don't have to use even vacuum. You can just go in and then chop the cataract. I have videos on YouTube also. I do a mechanical chop, and once I get one crack, then if it's soft, even the half of the nucleus can be removed once you go into the Phaco tube with the OSIL. The followability is very good. Sometimes in very young patients, the nucleus is so soft that you can actually prolapse it into the antechamber or part of it into the antechamber, and then with a high flow rate, what is important is to use a high flow rate. If you're using a very low flow rate, then the followability is very poor, and then you can't actually evacuate the soft cataract. If you're using a high flow rate, then there is no problem. And with a Centurion, you can use a high flow rate because the chamber is stable. Most people are hesitant about using high flow rates because of chamber instability and then surge. But if that is not there, using a high flow rate, actually your surgery is faster and the followability is much better. Even for softer cataracts, you don't have to move the tip in the chamber. When you move the tip in the chamber, then if you go to the periphery, then the higher chances of complications like catching the iris or having a PC rent. If you're staying with your Phaco tip right in the center and we have minimal movement because of a high flow rate, then the chances of complications also are less.
Using balance tip for these soft cataracts, no change in the tip?
Yes, yes. No change in the tip. I just use the balance tip.
Are there any conditions where you feel that 20 IOP is less, you would like to use specific conditions?
Actually, I'm not actually, before I started off with like 40 or so, and then I kept reducing it. And even at 20, I found that there was no difference. So if I find that the chamber is shallowing, suppose I have a very shallow chamber, and I find that the bag is not opening up adequately, then I can raise the IOP. Sometimes you can have problems with the cassette where it's not, you see that the chamber is shallowing. The sensing may not be 100%, and then you may have to raise your IOP, but that is quite rare. We have had that once, but usually if the chamber is shallow, like in the last patient, he had Pickwickian, so the chamber was shallowing, but even with 20 IOP, it's fairly stable. But if I feel at any time that the chamber is shallowing, then I increase it to maybe 30, 40. So what is important is the safety. If you're able to work at these parameters safely, then it is good.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Dr. Sri Ganesh. Actually, what you're saying about, see, there's no, what I would suggest the Alcon, the company also is, it's a good thing to have an indicator somewhere that the active fluidics is working. Because the point is when the cassette is failing or it's not working, it is, I know we get to know while you're doing surgery, but when you're doing a quick surgery or something, you might not realize immediately there might be some problems. So it's a good point to just have an indicator with the sound saying, okay, active fluidics is off, or whatever. Some kind of a indicator where it's not working optimally, at least some kind of indicator, so that the surgeon goes one step back and then brings up the parameters, comes to a little more safer settings, and then he goes forward.
No, just change the cassette. See, we have had it once where we found that there was some amount of
same here.
If you're having a at the same parameters, if you're having a good chamber stability, and suddenly you find that one day that the chamber is shallowing, it's mostly because of the cassette. So I suggest you just change the cassette, and then everything will be fine, and that's what we did. Because the safety comes first. I mean, you don't want to compromise on the safety, but each surgeon has to assess his capabilities and look at what parameters are ideal for him. And with time, as you get used to working with those parameters, most surgeons don't change their parameters. They don't experiment at all. But what I suggest is once you get comfortable with one particular parameter, then you can kind of experiment, go to slightly higher flow rates. The surgery also becomes a little faster. The followability becomes better. And it's nice. I mean, it's like driving a car. You can always drive at 40 kilometers, but if the car is capable at going at 200 kilometers and you have a nice road, then you should definitely try to accelerate and see what the car is capable of doing. So I find that these parameters work very well. I mean, it's not that everybody has to use these parameters, but this is just a demonstration that, yes, this machine is capable of these parameters, and we are able to work very safely, all different types of cataracts, dense cataracts, mature cataracts also can be done with the same parameters very safely. And so actually, these are the parameters that I use day in and day out. So I'm very comfortable with that.
Actually, these parameters really spoil you. Once you start using it, the time you downplay the settings, actually, especially in complicated, you feel like everything is too slow for you. You feel very kind of a little agitation you get that it's too slow. Once you get used to those settings, you just simply, So I think,
and especially if you have a big list, then you want to go through your list
quickly
as quickly as possible,
as quickly
as possible, and as quickly as possible. So
That's
this
true.
is when it helps. I think especially Narayan also is a kind of high volume. We also, when you have like about 30 or 40 on the list, then you want to get through it quickly.
Just one question. I can see the ingenuity behind. So just little off topic. So how often, as a cataract surgeon, do you use actually? I mean, other than retina surgeon, definitely it's a wonderful tool where you can really zoom in. As a cataract surgeon, how often, or is there any particular situation that you use it?
I have tried the ingenuity and it's quite good. The only thing is there is still a little bit of lag for anterior segment surgery, especially if you are doing very fast surgery. There's a little bit of lag. You get used to it as you're working on it. The advantages is the ergonomics. It's quite comfortable on your neck and back, so you can sit up straight and look at the screen. The other advantage is that irrespective of the microscope, the contrast is excellent, the depth is excellent. So you have both magnification and depth, which you can't get in a microscope. Your magnification and depth, and all the observers and your assistant has the same view that you are having. And your video recording is spot on because you're never decentered. With a microscope, sometimes you're working and sometimes it's decentered, and later on you see the video and then it's a little decentered. But with the ingenuity, it's basically centered all the time perfectly. So that's another advantage, and it's very easy to put in different overlays, especially for toric and capsulotomy and all that. So I think with time, most of the companies are coming up, and then as the electronics improves, the lag will reduce. So it's much faster. And I think maybe microscopes will be obsolete in some time. I have a YouTube video also, will microscopes be obsolete, where I have demonstrated a few cases with the ingenuity, and it worked quite well. There's a learning curve, maybe a couple of cases where you have to reorient yourself. But once you do that, then it's fairly easy to do.
So true, actually. Like you said, it's sometimes, actually, when I looked at it, it seems, I mean, anyone looks at the screen and you see, okay, it's going to be difficult to do. But actually, it's not that bad. Once you start operating, then at one point, you'll forget that actually you're seeing the screen and operating. You'll be so engrossed in the TV screen and just operating. You just don't realize. And the wonderful, in terms of the clarity of the screen and the depth perception is wonderful. Yeah, so true. Yeah.
Okay, I think then you can carry on with the program, and if there are no more questions from the panel, you can carry on with the practice development talk, and then I will join you all there. We will join you all there for taking questions from the webcast. So those who are logged on, the viewers who are logged on, I hope you all enjoyed the live surgery session. You can just put in all your questions and doubts on the chat, and then we'll be going through them, and then we will select the questions. And after the practice development talk, we will be answering most of the questions and discussing the questions if you've not already covered it in this session. So thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed this live surgery session.
Fantastic, Dr. Sri Ganesh. Thank you so much. Hope you don't come in the same pace you operate.
With this, we come to the end of the live surgery session. I'm sure all of you have enjoyed the visual treat. We congratulate all the surgeons for the excellent demonstration of the techniques. I call upon Mr. Saurabh Das to talk on practice management, make, manage, and mount your practice. Mr. Saurabh Das heads the practice development team of Alcon India Marketing. He's a biomedical engineer by qualification with close to 20 years of experience in healthcare industry. And he's an industry pioneer in introducing patient counseling in Indian eye care, and worked closely with more than 500 practices in eye care in India and neighboring countries. Over to you, Mr. Das.
Right, is it up? Thank you very much. At the outset, I would like to thank Netradama, Dr. Sri Ganesh, for having and giving me and us the opportunity to present before you all. In fact, having the only non-clinical subject in this entire scientific session. though not very surprised because it comes from a practitioner who himself happens to be a visionary in the field and concept of practice development. So thank you very much for having me. As she just introduced, my name is Saurav Das, and I head up the practice development team of Alcon India. We are a team of 5, 6 of us. We are a team of 5, 6-year-old team. And collectively, we have 70 years of experience in eye care. And the only thing that we do in this organization is practice development, or that is integrating any advanced technology into the practice through patient awareness, staff training, and practice support initiatives. And what I'm going to share in the next 30 minutes until Dr. Sri Ganesh just steps in is giving you 3 different case scenarios. I just wanted to keep the scientific format on, and I'm going to give you 3 different practice scenarios. These are real life scenarios that various practitioners have had. Obviously, I have not disclosed the identity of these practices. The best way to enjoy and get the best out of this practice, of this presentation, is imagine yourself in one of these scenarios, and I'm sure you'll find a place where you'll see yourself in one of the scenarios, and what are the best things that this practitioner did, and what are the best things that you could probably do under this scenario. So let's get started with this. So here's the first scenario. Is the audio? Here's a young practitioner. He's just completed his fellowship in cataract and refractive, and he's going back home to start his own practice. This is a tier 2 town. He has limited funds, as you can imagine. He has a senior practitioner already in the practice, 2 charitable institutes in the neighborhood, no refractive practitioner in 150 kilometers range. His father doesn't come from an eye care. He's a family physician, and his objective going back home is to somehow make it big. So what's the couple of things that this gentleman could actually do? And when I say tier 2 towns, it is the Raipurs and the Rajkots and the Hublis, for that matter, in this particular case. So here are a couple of things that that practitioner did, and this is what I also recommend that one should be doing into. And before that, a quick study. This was one of the surveys came out from US, which said that what is one of the most important things that patients would want to see when entering into a practice. And majority of them actually said that they wanted immediate reception, somebody to quickly attend them. And that's what basically comes when it comes to the front desk. These are a couple of tips that, you are, or this practitioner was lucky to start up this practice, and anybody in the webcast who are in this scenarios can probably look. If you're doing a reception, the front desk happens to be the most important thing. You don't need to have a big reception area. The only thing that you need is a small, but a clean reception area. And the worst thing that you'd want to have is cluttered cups and soiled papers and all the other things lying here and there. Telephone and receptions are antonyms, and that's something that in this starting stage, this gentleman did was, separate the telephone out of the reception. You simply cannot have a telephone and answering a patient at the same time. The primary job of a front desk personnel is to smile. I mean, that's about it. The mantra that we tend to tell them is, you fake it till you make it. It's as important as that. And do engage patients, do engage front desk people who are pleasant in personality. It will really pay off in the long term. If you're doing your seating arrangements, here's a little formula that you can probably do in terms of the seating arrangements. For an OPD of 50, you probably need around 30 odd seating chairs. And this is a sequence of formula that you would probably want to use. First is, if you have a probability, if you have a large space, try to have adequate seating arrangements along with comfortable ones. If that is not possible, then you'd probably want to have more quantity of them and less comfortable ones. But the worst thing and the last thing that you would probably want to have is a very comfortable sofas or comfortable couches, but a very limited one. That's something that will really not work out well for you. And let's start this gentleman, this practitioner, and this is normally the investment pattern that most of you all and most of them tend to do is, you tend to invest most in the infrastructure and then on the equipment and then on the staff, which is correct, by the way. But here's something that you could probably consider doing is investing a little bit more into the staff. They are those assets that, they are assets that they're going to actually run your practice. When I say investment, it doesn't mean only the remuneration that you give to the staff, but in terms of the time, energy, and focus that you spend in grooming the staff per se. And that's where it comes to the next thing is the next best investment, and this is what the practitioner did after investing in a good Phaco machine and a microscope is probably investing in a good patient counselor. Dr. Renichetti mentioned earlier, you cannot, you have no idea. I mean, if you don't have a patient counselor in place, there's something that you're strongly missing out on. It is not simply taking away, the job of a counselor is not simply taking away your chair time and making those discussions with your patients so that, you are freer, but it actually, the job of patient counselor is actually becoming a part of the family. And if you're in a situation where you get an opportunity to do your counseling room all over again, try to have a round table, just like the one that you see in the screen. A rectangular table, the formula is for the surgeons, which is I say and you listen. Whereas a round table is more towards, let's take a decision as a family. And that's where the counselor becomes a part of the family. And then the conversions and then the discussions tend to be much more lucid. So the biggest question that, people tell me is, done, taken, where do I find counselors? And that's something that, that's the $1 million question. So these are two different options that you can probably look and hunt for counselors. One is, of course, you have these different industries where you find good counselors, with the type of communication skills we have realized is like the aviation industry. Not everybody in the aviation industry make it to the airlines per se, but there are several others who get polished in this entire classes and they turn out to be good counselors. Likewise for the real estate agencies or the tourism counseling agencies, they tend to become they're good counseling materials for you. So, but the most important thing in this particular thing is, give them appropriate remuneration, and it'll pay off. And while you're doing so, keep a standby, trained person ready so that just in case she had to leave or he had to leave, you have an option. The second option, of course, if it doesn't work out, is upskill your existing staff. That's the most easiest thing to do. Front desk people typically do a good job in doing becoming a good counselors. But one of the incorrect things that most of the practitioners tend to do is they try to make them overwork. They give so much of multitasking and they end up doing everything that counseling becomes just a by the way thing and not the core thing. And that's something that you should be looking and watch out for. If you're setting up your practice, do well with your name boards. And also for the ones who have already an established practice, if your name boards, the practice name boards are worn out, don't wait till the Sheras and Diwalis to do it all over again. This creates a whole new personality of your practice, which you would probably want to invest. Give each one of your staff members an appropriate clean uniform and a designation badge. These days, there's a designation for every staff in your practice. A person who is swapping your, who is doing your floor clinic, who is doing your floors, can also have a designation called as the housekeeping or the electrician and so on and so forth. But designation turns out to be a very critical thing. Most of the practices, to start with, they start and ordering, the television set in their in their OPDs, and most of the times when we visit, the thing that they tend to show up in most of you, I don't know whether you do, that you play in your television is a news channel. Now that's the most incorrect thing to play in any practice, whether you're in a startup practice or established one. We all know this. Here's the little science. We all know what we play. What happens in news channels these days. You have rapes, murders, and so on and so forth. The patient is in a different state of mind. And when then he's called for, Mr. Rao, please come in, and you say that, you know what, Mr. Rao, you have cataracts, you have to shell out 40,000 rupees. And that's not the correct state of mind to be in, when this discussion is happening. A better option is, and that's what, we would recommend, is playing travel channels, music channels, something which is soothing. Happy to share that an Alcon has designed a very appropriate mix of loop videos, which has got the best combination possible. And we'll be happy to share with you in some point in time. So this is the ideal patient flow that works out best, based on multiple practices. This is the ideal patient flow. And this is what actually assists the conversion of premium procedures also. While pricing your fees, and this is something that you would want to consider, especially if, here's the two little studies that we have, incidentally, this is a study which is not far off. This is just 6 months old studies where it says that 6 out of 10 patients in India in metros and mini metros towns are willing to pay 70,000 rupees for an LVC procedure and as much as high as 50,000 rupees for a cataract procedure. So never compromise, never compromise at any point in any stage of a career in charging appropriately for the services that you offer. Instead, concentrate on adding value. Here's a little mathematics. Value tends to be value is nothing but benefit minus cost, which is, for a patient standpoint, it's the willingness for a patient to come back versus the experience. So if you tend to add on the experience, you can charge probably whatever you want. So here's the little conclusion on to this is that you might probably in this initial stage win the price discussion, but you will never be able to win the value discussion. In this particular case, this particular practitioner, he ended up buying a refurbished. Of course, we realized that he didn't have enough funds, but he ended up buying a refurbished laser unit, and you realize that there was no LASIK practitioner in the vicinity of 150 kilometers. A Harvard study, incidentally, done with close to 700 healthcare professionals, stated that 7 out of 10 practitioners who adopted technologies earlier, who were early adopters, had actually become very successful. So that was as high as 7 out of 10, 70% of them were very successful, which means at any point in time, if you invest, it's never a bad thing to do so. You get a lot of PR advantage in the initial stage if you're in town. And also the additional advantage is you are able to charge a little bit more premium in the oral services that's there. Change your phrases. Dr. Naren Shetty again also talked about the way you would want to describe the, let's say for the halos and glares and so on and so forth. Change your phrases in which you communicate with your patients, and tune your practices, tune your staff practices to do so. For example, the earlier way of communication would have been, I have all the IOL services that you probably need. Tell me what you need. Here's the new way of putting it forward, wherein you can say that, what are your visual needs? I have a service, I have a lens that can address your needs. Here's the next scenario that I want to put forward. Let's say it's a 10-year-old practitioner. He has been reasonably doing well in his practice. He has minimal financial liabilities, same tier 2 town. He has a good OPD, has good surgical volume as well, fairly good setup, has almost acquired the basic things. And then he's the top practitioner of that particular town. But unfortunately, he has frequent patient grievances. He tends to spend a lot of time resolving in daily bottlenecks. His premium procedures are not growing. And what's more, the neighborhood practice is quickly catching up. His objective is, how best can he manage this entire practice? And maybe I've done this sessions earlier. Majority of them say that we by and large tend to fall in this particular category. And let's see how best we can manage the patient expectations. So the fundamental mantra is, this is the mother mantra, if you've realized, if you have figured out the way to make your patients feel important, that's about it. And that could be anything for that matter. And if you're not able to figure out how you're likely to make them feel, how you're likely to make your patients feel important, you will land up in patients having grievances. And here are the top 5 reasons based on a survey which could potentially turn a patient off in a practice. The first happened to be impolite staff. No surprises over there. Second happened to be unproductive and excessive waiting period time. The third was a shocker for us, which said ill-maintained washrooms. The fourth happened to be lack of surgeon involvement. And the fifth, which potentially we thought could be the first one, is the disproportionately charged fees. And here's a little science to it. And let's see how best you can probably address them. Now, if you have a check-in, check-out time period with your patients for a primary examination, which is more than 90 minutes, your patients are probably doing 2 things. One is visiting the washrooms quickly, washrooms again and again, or probably asking the nearest staff that he or she feels is important, mera number kab aayega? And that is where the grievance starts. And which is where the concept of floor manager comes in. Floor manager is somebody who you can potentially appoint, whose job is to clear these bottlenecks, who becomes the one point of contact, who has access to each and every divisions and departments of the hospital, and make sure that the patient's flows and the grievance is cleared. There are a couple of examples. This is Naranitra and Netrudhama, which who have adopted this principle. And likewise, there are several other practices which have found immense success in terms of the patient satisfaction that they received by implementing this. Engage patients, engage people with, who can actually clear the washrooms every now and then. It's really, really, really worth it. And there are a list of value adds that you can potentially add up. One of the things that, potentially we found was very interesting, and a lot of practices are quickly catching up, is giving them a priority check-in card. patients who are premium patients, who have potentially, gone for the premium procedures or maybe a flax procedure and so on and so forth, what's best that you can give it to them is giving them a priority check-in, which means the next time you visit him or her, and if your practice where you can commit, there'll be a check-in. There's no commercial burden. There'll be a check-in within 15 minutes, something of that sort. And patients really love it. Here are the list of value adds, probably whatever works best in your school of thoughts, you can probably implement in your practice. Now to the main topic, how do we incorporate the premium IOLs in your practice? And that's something which is something the point of discussion today. But before that, here are 5 reasons why you should be implementing and why should be integrating advanced technology in your practice. Number 1, it widens your basket of services. Number 2, you give modern visual options to your patients. Number 3, this is the best way or one of the best ways to keep your practice apart from your neighborhood practice. It enhances your revenue for sure. And then you're preparing yourself for the newer advances. Just imagine, that practitioners who have not yet started Toric as of now, when will they elevate to the newer technologies in the days to come? But much before that, something which really sells is your self-conviction. And practitioners who have sold to this technology, just like how we've heard Dr. Sri Ganesh and many others, if you're not convinced about this technology, it'll never show up in your communication. So from the fact that, from the communication point where you say that, and I wish I had patients for advanced IOLs, to the situation where you can probably say that every clinically suitable patient should be having a premium lens implanted or this particular technology implanted in his or her eyes. Now, here's the little gap that I was mentioning about, and which is an irony in India for us. 7 out of 10 patients, as I said, in India are willing to pay up to 50,000 rupees for a cataract procedure. But the irony is only 2 out of 10 patients are actually offered a procedure, premium procedure. I'm sure you will realize the gap. And this is again a survey that comes out very recent from a very reputed company. Hence, the mantra that you should be having is every potential patient, every patient who walks into your practice should be at least offered the services that you give them for the practice, for the cataract procedure, for that matter, any other procedures. Somehow you have to figure out in your practice so that they are aware, even if they can't afford it, but they are aware of the particular services that is available in the practice. Here are the few other tips. These are a couple of illusions popularly that you can see it in Google. And incidentally, this one as well, which is recommending is selling. Some of the top practitioners, that we have visited and we have worked closely with have a very unique recommendation style. Traditionally, a recommendation style, when, and most of you would have faced a situation where the patient would say that, whatever you say, I will, and I'll go with your decision. In this way, there could be potential 2 different answers. One of the answers, which most of the practices tend to say is that, whatever you decide, me and my team will do the best. And the second one, which is the recommendation style, the newer style that I've seen is in the same conversation, and the practitioner would say that, Mr. Rao, had I been in your place, for my father, I would have opted for this package. However, whatever you choose, me and my practice will do the best. And it makes a lot of difference. The patient might probably not walk out with a trifocal lens implant, but will walk away with a lot of clarity and lot of satisfaction that he could probably think and probably recommend someone else as well. Everybody potentially can recommend in your practice, right from the front desk people, front desk, optometrists, your paramedical staff. And these are different recommendation styles that you can probably think of. The role of optometrists in India is highly underutilized. Unfortunately, the optometrists are looked upon by patients to be the next important and the next best after the surgeons, because they do the measurements and testing and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, in India, majority of optometrists do not have the communication beyond chin up, chin down, look towards the light. We together should actually encourage them to do much more meaningful conversations into the practice, and such that they become good patient journey enablers in this entire journey. Here's a little concept that that you would probably want to consider, and is the post-operative counseling. And this is something that we're driving hard, and we figured it out that this is something which is wrong. Now, technically, if you would have done, let's say 100, 150 or 200 premium cases, whatever in your definition premium would mean, torics or multifocals or whatever it is, it should have typically multiplied, isn't it? If you have 200, over a period of 6 months, 8 months, it should have multiplied. Many times it doesn't multiply. And what's the probable reason behind this? is probably the fact that, this patient would have got a clinical wow factor. Clinical would be correct. But since we did not, or you did not spend time with them after the surgery is done, the patient is probably thought, or the caregiver has thought, that this is how it is supposed to be. What's the big deal about it? And that is why he did not go tom-tom telling to his friends and relatives, you know what, I had a multifocal lens done. That's why the importance of creating that emotional wow factor becomes very important in this entire procedure, in this entire premium procedure consideration per se. Several tools are available that we'll be happy to share with you, through which you can actually potentially create that wow factor, and more than creating the wow factor, create a system in your practice wherein this amount of chair time is delivered to each and every patient. Once couple of tricks, pardon the wrong words, or tips, let me say, is like these, like the pre-op reading evaluation form. This is something that you can probably do, just for creating the wow factor. This is nothing but it's just a form which is in different font size written. Before the surgeries, you take the consent and ask your patient to read to what points they're able to read, and just take a small signature from them. After the surgery is done, you've checked the refraction and so on and so forth, ask your patient to read again. And they would say that, Mr. Rao, from 12 points, you've gone down to 8 points. If there is a 2-line increment in what you've read, and suddenly the wow factor would be enormous. Science has proved that, just like the military crisis simulation, simulations are the best way of demonstrating, or debriefing, medical debriefing. And several simulators these days are available. And Alcon has been happy to have one with us, which is the Actress of Vision Simulator. This is one of the best ways and the best tool that is available in the world today, wherein, you can simulate pre-op and post-op surgical with different lens options, in this case. And this is available with us as an offline version, also as an Apple version, iOS version. We'll be happy to share with you at any point in time. And this will really be a big practice enabler for you. Likewise, how you can simulate torics, in terms of, you can have different glass sets. And we have a trial set for ourselves, which simulates different cataract stages, as well as, different astigmatism stages. And, you can have your patients wear this and realize that what we have chosen versus what they couldn't have. Here's a little trick that you would probably try, which is the reverse package proposal. Normally, the best way, and normally, our counselors, or even for that matter, if they asked one, what are the packages, the normal communication would be, we have packages ranging from 10,000 to 70,000, or whatever that number could be. Try this, and where you say that we have packages starting from 70,000 to 10,000. We do not know exactly what is the science behind it, but it really works most of the times. Try this for 1 week in your practice. Encourage your counselors to do that, and you'll find it for yourself. Here's one more trick, tip kind of thing, but let me first prove the theory part of it. Based on a National Health Medical Research Survey done in Australia, when a written consent was done, the conversion ratio turned out to be as high as 50%. Based on the same thing, we developed something called as the Toric opt-out letter. Now, this is a very simple, but a very useful, impactful letter that, a consent form, which is basically there. Whenever a patient in any point in time, suppose they choose not to go for astigmatism or for toric implant, you just tell them a simple thing. No problem, Mr. Rao. You just have to sign a small consent. And the consent basically says that I, so-and-so, hereby decide not to choose to treat my astigmatism. I understand, but that by not choosing to treat my astigmatism, I'll continue to remain spectacle dependent for the rest of my life. And this is when happens that the reconsideration ratio tends to become much more higher. A very simple trick that can work out, and you'll find out a lot of immense value that, you'll be able to create in this particular confirm. We have different, sorry, I missed a slide. You have different forms of patient awareness that is there. Instead of having jazzy patient awareness materials, I think simplistic way of demonstrating the awareness materials like this one, this is called as a pencil animation, is something that really works out well. But, the biggest mantra is, happy patients tend to bring you much more happy patients. So let me take you to the next and the final scenario, which is the case 3. Oops. Okay. Here we go. So here's an established practitioner, a cataract refractive surgeon, obviously an early adopter of technology, in tier 2 towns like the Bombays and the Delhis, great OPDs, great surgical volumes, obviously is the top practitioner of the town. but has a stagnant growth since the past 3 years. And his objective is, how can he mount his practice? You hear a couple of things that you can probably look into. Cold calls are a very important part of the entire journey. Based on the survey, most of the refractive decisions, as good as 70% of the refractive, purchase decisions happens over the cold calls. You can probably try this, and you can see if you're missing out on these opportunities, wherein is your telephone operator handling these calls correctly. Try doing a mystery call, which is just behaving as if you're patients, and try to see how your front desk personnel are doing on these. Was the call adequately answered well? How well did they answer the questions, and so on and so forth. And you'll realize that there could be a potential leakage that you would quickly want to address. Second is investing in new technologies. This obviously has twin benefits, and most practitioners realize that, in this stage, this is something that you would be. It not only continuously creates patient interest, but it also motivates internally to your staff in doing something new and different. Incremental footfalls and patient revenue, and also an opportunity to retain to the patients for a larger time. External marketing, of course, helps. That's something that at this stage you should be considering. One mantra is, this is something which should be done by the expert. If you probably potentially do not understand this subject, leave it to the experts to do. A lot of testimonials in external marketing, patient testimonials, is a very important asset that you could consider. Again, what really works best is internal marketing. A simple board over here that you see, which is like a new arrival board. Every time you acquire a new technology, it could be just a biometer or anything for that matter. You can say new arrived, and patients passing by here and there will realize and get that mindset that this is a practice which is investing in new technologies. Caregivers are an important part, and this stage when you are in an established practice, caregiver management tends to become important. Caregivers are the decision makers. More than that, they are the influencers. Try to have the communication which was designed towards them. Give them relevant knowledges. Use, just don't go by verbal communication, verbal counseling. Just use tools and applications to better share with them. And then comes, of course, staff training. This is again based on a survey where practices were asked, what is something that you would really want to invest more on, and majority of them said that staff training is something that they would want to, because at this stage, the worst thing that you want to do is lose out on important staff members and retain them. You want to retain them. So staff training, continuous staff training, it not only helps give them confidence, but also, enhances, the confidence of the practice, and also helps you battle those ever-growing attrition rate at every point in time. We as an organization have been, always been driving, and we have been very passionate about staff training programs, and we continue to invest and support in various staff training programs, and we'll be happy to share and be a part of you as well. Staff motivation, whatever works best in your school of thoughts, whether it is rewards, recognitions, is something that you would want to consider. And then the last few slides, which is, of course, a lot of practices today have NABH accreditations. So NABH accreditations or any other relevant accreditations, while everybody would realize that it's the journey which is much more rewarding, but much behind this, try to devise a communication for the patients. What does NABH mean to the patients? Market your NABH accreditations in terms of what is that the patients could probably want to look forward when they enter into an NABH accredited hospital. And that is when you'll find the real benefit of it. In this stage of an established practice, now one last thing that really could work well and it could be introduced is medical tourism. Medical tourism today tends to become a $60 billion industry worldwide. And today, just to give an example, from US alone, every year, 11 million travelers step out of their place, step out of USA for medical tourism. And this is growing every year by 25%. India is one of the most popular destinations because they save close to 65 to 95% per treatment. Cardiac care and eye care happens to be the most sought after treatments. And there are several ways, several agencies, several liaisons who can help you liaison up. But this is something that you would want to consider. However, having said that, in my last 30 minutes of discussion, the key thing is how well you implement it. If there's something that you feel which is correct, I think the biggest roadblock is that you don't implement it. If there are a couple of things you feel it could work correct in your practice, Monday morning, try and see if you can implement and execute this. That's it from my side. Thanks for your attention, despite WhatsApp trying to contest for the same. At any point in time, if you have any support, any guidance that is needed, here are the contacts of me and my team, and we'll be pleasantly glad to support you and help you with any others queries. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great evening ahead. Thank you very much. Dr. Ganesh is on the way still? Yeah. So there's a panel discussion, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Das, for the great insight into practice development. Our surgical team will be joining us shortly. In the meantime, I request our panelists to take the questions from the audience.
So, yeah.
Not doing the surgery is important, getting patients properly.
And believe me, what he presented, it seems like just a small talk, but actually every slide has so much meaning. I mean, it is a wonderful presentation. Believe me, even if you just implement 1 or 2 slides, what he said, actually it'll make a huge difference. Because this is not something I'm just telling, because this is something that I personally have implemented, and already it's been going on since so many years. And these things make a huge difference, because this what makes you change the whole branding. That is, you're making your patients itself your brand ambassadors. So to make that happen, these are the changes that you need to implement.
I think to start the discussion with the surgical team, I think for Shahid, I think I've seen him operating. I think Dr. Ganesh and Dr. Shahid represent the diametrically opposite options for the surgical journey. Dr. Shahid is very meticulous, and he kind of believes in 100% perfection, 100% error-free surgery. He does so meticulously that he takes even the great amount of care, even the so-called seemingly trivial steps. It doesn't want to take any chance. I mean, even I have seen Dr. Senior also operating exactly the same methodology. So, Dr. Shahid, what is the timing of surgery, the time taken for a cataract surgery? It's a double-edged sword, everybody knows. How do you want to actually define that? And then what do you tell about the surgical timing?
I think surgical time is important, but more important is what we do with that surgical time. So, even if you do say, I mean, there are, of course, there's no comparison with Dr. Ganesh. Is absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal. But I think if you work, if for an average surgeon, if you're working very fast, usually the chances are you're working closer to the endothelium rather than away from it, because you'll be using slightly higher parameters. For majority of average surgeons like me, who are timid surgeons, who are not very, who are scared of things going wrong, I think the safer way is to use slightly lower parameters so that you can stay quite away from the endothelium and still work as comfortably and at a sufficiently quick pace. I think time is important, but time is the last thing on the list that should be on the list of your surgical checklist. Whatever time it takes, it has to be safe time, and of course, the lesser the fluid you use, the faster you finish off the surgery, the lesser the chances of damaging things. But on the other hand, on the flip side, there are also more chances of staying closer to the endothelium, catching the capsule or the iris from time to time, and so on. So I think there is no one guideline, but whatever you find safe, whatever you find safe in your hands is most important.
Well, coming for the beginners, if I'm right, what you are trying to ask, I think the beginners have to work on basically a few important things. The first is, time is an aftermath. The first and foremost important thing is you should see what your surgical efficiency is. You have to, retrospect your surgeries. If you find that you're not able to do a step in one go, this means a good amount of introspection has to be done, so that you have to evolve a way. You have to ask your peers, your seniors, why this was not done. Why I couldn't hold the nucleus well. If I've not been able to hold the nucleus well, what was wrong with it? So it's basically, once you start having that mindset, wherein you have to move from the struggle phase to the smooth phase. And for that, you have to develop an introspection, retrospection sort of modality in your mindset. Time, sir, you will certainly find time will go on decreasing. So time is not ultimately that important, but your efficiency is the more important thing. If by any means your pupil is, I'm giving you an example. If at the start of the surgery, the pupil is 8 millimeter, if it has come down, because I personally believe it's the trauma to the iris which is causing everything. You have to realize, for example, what has caused the pupil to constrict that V bit, that small bit. Is your side port incision wider enough, which is causing, some amount of trauma to the iris, and with the pupil coming down? All these things have to be borne in mind. So if, what we have learned, what we have seen from Dr. Sri Ganesh was that he was not struggling. Why was he not struggling? So that is what, so ultimately time is nothing which should,
So true, actually, things extremely important because retrospective analysis of yourself is very important. So recording your videos is the first most important thing that you have to do, because you don't know what, sometimes you don't realize what mistake you're doing unless you go back and see the videos. Please record your videos, look back, and definitely I keep telling my fellows, all of them, I keep telling speed is not important. Speed has no value at all. You can operate even for 40 minutes, even 1 hour, and still have a clear on the next day. So the most important thing is, I would say, if you ask me one tip, which will assure you that clear on the next day is the plane of surgery. If you maintain the plane nice and deep, if you just maintain your plane of surgery nice and deep, no matter how long you take your surgery, how long you do,
actually, they were demanding a dope test for you, actually. No, Naren, just completing the other thing. I just seen you a few years ago as an undergrad student in Dhaba, but you have blossomed into a very high volume, a very quick, very safe, and a very accomplished surgeon. Like, what really did go into this transformation so quickly?
Why I keep stressing on speed is because when I was learning myself, at certain points in my period of learning, I keep looking at past surgeons. I think speed, and my whole mindset when I do the surgery is some few days, I should think that, okay, I have to do fast. That's when it went down. So that's when I learned it in a hard way that it's not the speed that you have to focus. Just focus on your technique. Speed just comes up like that. You just simply focus on your technique, how to do things and everything. Very good. And naturally, your speed, believe me, picks up so quickly, you don't even realize that you become so fast. One day you just go back to your videos and you see, oh my God, I'm operating this speed and at this time. Oh, wow, that's fantastic. Never go after the.
Yeah, I'll just ask Ganesh. I think what we saw, Dr. Sri Ganesh is a quick surgeon, not a surgeon in hurry. I think this makes the difference. If you are a surgeon in a hurry, trying to save time, I think it's going to be devastating. I think if you're a quick surgeon, trying to optimize your systems and processes, which are going to take away the time, and invest this amount of time that is required for a particular stage or for a particular situation, I think that's what is the final thing. I think Sri Ganesh will probably have the.
So basically, it is, you become a fast surgeon by not repeating your movements. You have to be meticulous, whether it's a particle cleanup or capsule polishing. You saw that I do all these steps, and you have to be meticulous. Where you same time is they will not repeat steps. So every step has to be precise. That is surgical precision. I mean, that's what surgery is all about. That you do it with precision, and every step you should execute so that you do not have to repeat it. Whatever you have to accomplish is accomplished with a single movement. And if you practice that, if you reduce your repetition of steps, that's when you become faster. You don't have to do surgery in a hurry. If you do surgery in a hurry, then you will end up with complications. But what you have to learn is not to, so it's very important that you record your surgeries, go back and watch your surgeries. You watch your own surgeries, you learn from yourself. You see which are the steps where you're actually struggling or taking more time. For example, you just say hydrodissection. So many people, inject in multiple quadrants, then they go out with a cannula, then they take a dial and try to rotate with the dial. They're not able to rotate with the basically, you do not know the principles. If you know the steps, then once you do just one quadrant, you just do hydrodissection, you see the posterior fluid wave, you see the nucleus rising, you compress the nucleus, you have an anterior wave, and then you know it's completed. The nucleus will spin on its own just with your cannula. You don't have to put any force. So you have accomplished what you wanted to feed the nucleus in a single step, minimum amount of movements. And if you learn this, then your surgery automatically becomes faster. You won't have to hurry through your surgery.
What about optimizing the processes? Like we see a lot of process optimization, patient moving in and you're not moving out. And
yes, that you have to see. What I do is I have tables which kind of rotate. So the patients are already on a table prepared, and then they come into the OR under the microscope. So I'm sitting there. I don't have to change my foot pedal. I don't have to move from one table to another. The patient is prepared. They wheeled in. I operate. They wheeled out. Then the next table comes in. So it's very fast. So I'm able to have a turnover of almost 15 patients per hour when I operate. So it's pretty fast. In a couple of hours, I complete my whole list. So it's about getting the whole system together and your team. It's basically the teamwork. So even the assistant, the person who prepares, even outside the patients, shifting the patients, all this, it has to happen in a very synchronized movement. It's almost like a dance, so that things go on very smoothly. And then for the patient also, there is no hurry. Things go on very smoothly, but it is fast. So by the time I come out of my theater, in fact, all the patients are discharged. So the whole system is very simple.
Yeah, you can be rash at 20, but you can be safe at 80.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the basic.
And about the use of 2.8 sleeve versus 2.2, like why did this transition happen? And now do you anytime do 2.2?
I know use the 2.2 sleeve because what I find is people want to incision. I use a comparison. It's hardly significant. So I use a comparison like 2.8 is 0.27. It's within 0.3. So even if you're going for 2.2, it's better to have an incision which is not stressed, where you don't tear the fibers, rather than have a very small wound where you're doing a lot of manipulation and then the fibers are stretched and then you'll have to hydrate excessively to close it. Rather than that, you have to have an liquid wound which is safe to discharge. Now, the trapezoid incision is something that gives more stability because as you move the phaco tip, the little bit of the trapezoid incision, the internal being larger, it accommodates for the slight movement. So there's no stretching of the wound. So even when I complete my phaco and come out, the chamber is small. And I'm able to inject the lens even without hydrating. I just have to inject a little fluid and the bag opens up, the chamber is small, well, and I'm able to inject the saline. When I inject the saline, I want to use two steps you say. Doing viscoelastic, removing viscoelastic. Removing viscoelastic actually takes a lot of time. And the lens also it opens faster, and the road is basically once you align it under saline, then it stays put. It does not rotate. That's what I have found. My incidence of rotation has come down after I've started injecting under saline.
So that's a wonderful tip. What Dr. Sri Ganesh gave during the OT was not to overinflate the bag. Because when you have overinflated bag, again, especially in toric lenses, there's less contact because huge amount of fluid goes behind the lens. So very less contact. So it should be, the IOP should be most optimum. You shouldn't be too overinflated, having the fear that, okay, it might leak later or something. That shouldn't be it. Always make sure the IOP is most ideal, and that would lessen the chances of it rotating post-surgery.
The reason why you hydrate the wound is because you have stretched the wound. Ideally, if you have not stretched the wound, you don't have to hydrate the wound. And when you make a trapezoid kind of an incision, there is no stretching of the wound. That's another small tip. And when you don't stretch the wound, you don't have to do much of a hydration, very little hydration, because the hydration is not what is holding your wound. It's the wound construction. So if your wound construction is good, that's what I showed beginning of the procedure, the first procedure itself. Once you enter and come out, there's no leak. Even if you press on the cornea, there is absolutely no leak because your incision is perfect. The incision has to be good. Hydration is only to seal the wound if there is any wound stretch.
Yeah, Dr. Sheetal, I think you showed very eloquently the stop and chop technique, which probably we say that it should be the starting point and everybody should be doing it. For all cataracts, it works. Like one is about the depth, which is very important. Look, what is your idea about deepening the center? Some people go parallel to the posterior capsule. I mean, they go more of central deepening.
As you are getting deeper, you should not take full stroke from one end to the other. It's only when you are beginning. So your first 3-4 chops until you reach the center can be from one end to the other. When your probe is more deeper in the center, and as you come out, it should become little shallower. And when you need to deepen it, then you can just keep shaving it little bit in the center, yeah, so that you reach that ideal depth. And regarding this question, should we use dialer during trenching? I have never used a dialer during trenching. So I think it's basically to stabilize the eye or center the eye.
Like what do you do without the dialer?
I never use a dialer. I just hold the probe with my both hands and just pull the eye towards me. Most of the patients are in topical. So
no. You mean this is to crack the nucleus dialer?
I don't
what
know
is the question?
No, okay.
This is about the
during
dialer.
Trenching. They are asking during trenching. So
again, during trenching, some people use a dialer to push the nucleus away. And when you're using longitudinal phaco and you're sculpting, okay, when you're using longitudinal phaco and sculpting, if you engage the nucleus a little more, then you have occlusion. Once you have occlusion, especially you're going towards the periphery, then it does not dislodge. And when you actually pull back, the whole nucleus lifts up. So to avoid this, some people use a dialer. But the advantage with the Centurion, when you're using Ozil, there's no occlusion. Even when you go towards the periphery, because you have the side-to-side movement, you'd never have a full occlusion. And there's also increased cavitation. So it's very easy to sculpt and nice to sculpt. And you will never have an occlusion, and you will never have this problem of, when you're retracting the probe, that the whole nucleus is tilting up, because you don't have that occlusion in the periphery.
I think when you use both hands to hold your phaco probe, I just use both hands and then trench. It gives you better control on how deep you want to go. And I have never used any dialer, a second instrument, while trenching. This is how I think Dr. Ganesh taught me.
Bimanual trenching.
Bimanual, you can say.
No, it's about the question was about one was the depth. Second thing is like most of the beginners kind of prematurely go to crack it because they're worried about the depth. And so they just want to do a small trench. And so they fail in actually getting a full crack. So what do you actually ensure? I mean, how do you actually make sure that you have reached the right depth and the exact maneuvers or the kind of movements that, ensures
so one
a proper
criteria
crack?
could be to assess the depth, as I said, is that you can place your phaco tip inside, and it should be at least 2 or 2.5. So it should be at least 70 to 80% of the depth of the nucleus before you try to crack. And when you want to crack, you have to be deeper. Your walls should be vertical. If your walls are damaged, then you will not get that support. So your walls have to be vertical, and your instruments have to be deep in the groove, and then you can separate. If your instruments are superficial, then it will be difficult.
A few other small clues as to whether you're deep enough, because as you keep sculpting, especially in nuclear cataracts, the red glow improves. You know, the cataract itself is kind of whitish as you're sculpting. The whiteness keeps on reducing and your glow improves, and you know that, okay, you've passed through the densest part of the nucleus. The other clue is parallax. When you have a posterior subcapsular cataract and then you slightly move the nucleus side to side, then the depth of the groove and the distance, you can judge the distance between the depth of the groove and the posterior subcapsular opacity because of the parallax. And as you go deeper, the parallax keeps on reducing, and you know that you're pretty close to the posterior plate. And that's when you crack. In very soft and very dense nucleus, you have to sculpt fairly deep. You almost have to be at 80% depth. And some of the nuclei can be quite large. Normally, it's about anywhere from 4 to 5 millimeters. The Phaco tip approximately is about 1 millimeter. So 2.5 depths of the Phaco tip will give you an idea that, okay, you've gone beyond the densest part, and then you can crack. Suppose you're not able to crack, then that usually means that you're not sculpted enough. Then you can go and then sculpt a little more, shave the posterior plate, place your instruments deep in the groove. If you're superficial, then you don't get a very good crack. Place it deep, and then you'll have to split the posterior plate. When you split the posterior, you'll see the crack. You'll see that the glow improves. You can actually see the posterior capsule.
I think pushing it to the next technique, I think Savio, you showed a wonderful technique. I think that cross, it looked so easy. It was so nice. I know you must be a regular churchgoer because the cross is so quick and fast. You could crack it. But most people think that beginners, when they're taught divide and conquer, it's quite a bit of dexterity is required. A lot of Phaco energy goes in, a lot of time goes in creating that exact perfect cross. Somebody who knows Phaco well can create a perfect cross like that, like what you did. But for a beginner, it's so. Do you think it is kind of? I mean, is it the right logic to teach this technique beginners for the beginners?
What I would advise is that they should understand divide and conquer, and the first trench should be made by the trainer. And the student should make the trench perpendicular to that, so they'll have an idea of how much depth to go. Also, what happens is, why is divide and conquer so popular still now? Many surgeons all over the world still do it. It's very, very reproducible. And if you crack it into 4 quadrants, your surgery is virtually over. The depth which you go is very important. And yes, the dexterity, because your nucleus is like a boat. So you need to go into that correct shape of trenching. And once you reach that depth, you know it's perfect.
What should be the kind of ideal case for beginners?
Yeah, no taking a clear cortical cataracts or very soft cataracts. You need to have NS2 plus 3. Those are the ideal cases. A well-dilating pupil, because you can't trench in a small pupil, and if your anterior chamber is shallow, you'll have problems.
When you recommend, we recommend that beginners start off with divide and conquer. That's a classical technique, the 4-quadrant technique or divide and conquer that was described by Polcock was stop and chop. It was by Gimbel and John Shepard. And John Shepard called it 4-quadrant technique, and then Gimbel described it as divide and conquer. And you're using very low parameters. You use a very low flow rate, and almost you can do a zero vacuum kind of a sculpting. So the safety is quite good for beginners, because accidentally, if you catch the iris, also you have enough reaction time. Plus, you understand the anatomy of the nucleus. You understand how much of Phaco power to give and how deep you have to go, and when you reach adequate depth. This is all very important if you want to transit to the next step of chop, because for chop, you will have to be exactly at the sweet spot. You'll have to bury deep enough. Your chopper has to be deep enough. And sometimes you can have more complications when you start off with Phaco chop, and you have to use higher flow rates and vacuums. So for a beginner, we always advise start with divide and conquer, go to stop and chop, and then proceed to chop. And direct chop also, many people are not able to do a direct chop in all cases because it needs an understanding of the anatomy and the mechanical forces involved. And not all of them are able to get it in the first go.
I think, yeah, divide and conquer is definitely one technique that every surgeon should know. The reason is it can be your fallback technique because it can work in any grade of cataract. So if there is a grade 1 or only a PSC cataract or just an early cortical cataract, chop techniques are not the most efficient way to remove that, because you end up cheese wiring the nucleus and then you end up with a big bowl. Then you are left neither with a divided nucleus nor something that you can grab and divide. So I think 4-quadrant is something that we find very useful, particularly in softer cataracts, because they are neither choppable nor sort of crackable. And even if there are certain cataracts which are so soft that even when you try and divide them, they tend to cheese wire with the 4-quadrant. So don't worry about that. If your central plate is thin enough, and if you have a good cross, the fragments will buckle in. But if your central plate is not thin enough, no matter however much you may have created 2 fragments or 3 or 4, it will just not buckle into the phaco probe.
So one more small tip I keep telling my fellows is, initially all surgeons, when they're trying to chop, be divide and conquer, direct chop, stop and chop, what they do is when they come to that horizontal movement, the sideway movement, they just do it quick like this. So they don't know what is happening. They're lifting their dialer up, or the phaco tip is going down, going up. No idea. It just happens very quick. The point is you need to slow down at that point, because the more slower you are, you realize, okay, it's not dividing. Okay, then you position yourself properly, make sure it divides. So the point is you have to do the dividing also slow. So you're more aware of where your instruments are moving. And then once you become more established, you can do a quicker thing. But initially, it is very important to do slow, especially in soft cataracts. If you want a chop with the appropriate settings, actually you need to do a slow chop. You have to divide slowly, because then the fiber slowly. The faster you go through the lens completely, especially in soft if you want to do a direct chop. So that's one very important tip.
One of the questions was, what are the advantages of using a preloaded lens? Advantages of using a preloaded lens is the workflow is much easier. So you don't have, because if you're a high volume surgeon, then generally your assistant is loading the lens, and he's loading the lens outside the microscope. You may not see very well. If he doesn't load it properly, the lens may snag. You may have a tear in the haptic or optic, and the lens may get stuck. These are all issues which can happen. So with the preloaded, basically it's very easy to prepare the system outside the microscope. And the other advantage is the sterility is maintained. So the lens is not exposed to the atmosphere. So the sterility is maintained, and then it's much faster to do. And especially if the surgeon is becoming presbyopic, the assistant is becoming presbyopic, it's a boon to have a preloaded lens. So we'll just take the questions from the webcast. The other is about chamber stability and safety of injecting IOL under BSS. Now, this is something that I would not recommend beginners to do, because your wound has to be perfect. If you have to form the chamber with saline without hydrating it, your wound has to be perfect. And you will have to have an idea as to how much pressure you're giving. And if the chamber is shallowing, you should be able to notice that. Ideally, if you want to start injecting lenses under BSS, then you can use maybe your bimanual cannula, the irrigating cannula in the side port to maintain the chamber, and then you can inject the lens. The advantage is that putting in viscoelastic, removing the viscoelastic, 2 steps you save. Plus, for Torics, I find that the rotational stability is better post-op when I inject it under BSS. But you will have to assess your level of skill before you try it. It is not for everybody.
Yeah, I think what Dr. Ganesh summarized is wonderfully well. I think we have seen wonderful videos by Sir Dr. Rohit Om Prakash, and several surgeons who use the irrigating cannula, the bimanual irrigation from the side port and then inject through the main port. I think just to take a step back, we must realize that everything came up for a reason. So Rexis was being done under air, under saline initially, then came viscoelastic. So the reason for using viscoelastic is not just to create, just that little bit of space. It also helps, particularly for early surgeons, in easier unfolding of the IOL. Quite often in balanced salt solution, the IOL unfolding can get a little unpredictable. And if the chamber doesn't stay very stable, it can tilt, it can hit the endothelium, it can hit the posterior capsule. So like Dr. Ganesh mentioned, I think for beginner surgeons, definitely viscoelastic, but with time, probably we can.
The other question was coaxial or bimanual IA. So both have their advantages and disadvantages. The bimanual IA basically was introduced by Samuel Mascott, and where you separate the irrigation and then the aspiration. When you started Phaco, there were coaxial. It was only coaxial IA, but with coaxial IA, sometimes it was difficult to reach into the fornix, especially the sub-incisional cortex. So then there were different types of hook, the bent tip, and then there was a Binkos tip, which was like a J tip. But then with the bimanual IA, when you separate it, the advantage is that you can reach in all parts of the bag, all the fornix of the bag, anywhere in the bag, and then aspirate. And you can use lower parameters. You're going into the bag and you can do a thorough job. It's safer for beginners. So for beginners, we advise them to use bimanual IA. If you're using coaxial and you're using a low flow rate, then it becomes very difficult to remove cortex, especially sub-incisional cortex. And then some people struggle to remove the sub-incisional cortex. So bimanual IA for beginners is good. But the problem with bimanual IA is you can't use very high flow rate. The maximum flow rate you can go to is about 30 cc's. So with 30 cc's flow rate, the followability is not that good. So it's not a very fast procedure when you use bimanual when compared to coaxial IA. With the coaxial IA, you have more fluid going into the eye. So you can use flow rates of 60. So the followability is good. When you're using a coaxial, you have to use higher flow rate so that the followability is good, and then you're able to evacuate. You can even do the hurricane technique. You're able to evacuate the subincisional cortex. So I prefer coaxial IA because it's faster. I've used the bimanual IA. Some surgeons use bimanual IA. But for beginners, I would advise to start with bimanual IA, and then you can progress to a coaxial. And then, of course, you have one port less when you're using the coaxial. The bimanual, you have one. And bimanual IA, see, if you have a tight port and you're using the bimanual IA, then you're stretching the side port. So the side port, basically, you'll have to hydrate it well, otherwise it does not close. With the coaxial, I don't hydrate the side port because I have not stretched the side port. These are the advantages and disadvantages.
I think 21 years ago, in 1998, I think you did a live surgery in Karnataka Ophthalmic Society called in Davangere. Then, no, 97, 96 was Mangalore, 97, where bimanual had come for the first time. You demonstrated for the first time. Before that, there was a coaxial only. I think they have gone a full cycle now.
So multifocal IOLs, which is more important, angle kappa or angle alpha? So angle kappa is basically the angle between the visual axis and your pupillary axis. Now, this is more important in refractive surgery because in refractive surgery, you have eye trackers which center onto the pupil, but ideally you should center onto the visual axis. So you will shift. Most excimer lasers have keys where you can shift the aiming beam to the fixation point. So you are along the visual axis and ablate. Angle alpha is the angle between the visual axis and the optical axis. Now, what is the optical axis? The optical axis is usually the center of the limbus, the center of the bag, the optical axis or the geometric axis. And the visual axis, if it's different from the optical axis, then when you actually put in the lens actually centers in the bag. That means it centers to the optical axis or the geometric axis. Now, if there's a difference between your geometric axis and the visual axis, then the patient is actually seeing through the paracentral part of the lens. When he sees through the paracentral part of the lens, which has rings, then there can be more night vision problems and dysphotopsia. So if you have a large angle alpha more than 0.6, ideally, then the multifocal lens is not ideal. So we measured the angle alpha with the eye trace, but there are several devices in which with which you can measure the angle alpha. I think you have a good idea even with the Varian. With the Varian also it gives you the angle kappa and angle alpha. And we did a study on patient satisfaction and angle kappa and alpha, and we found that alpha is more important for patient satisfaction. If the angle alpha is very small, that means the visual axis and the geometric axis are in line, then the patient satisfaction is better. The next questions are tips for intraop IOL centration.
I think there are various strips that have been shown to align. The Purkinje image is the easiest, but quite often we find that like Dr. Ganesh mentioned correctly, the IOL ultimately is going to center at the center of the capsular bag. So no matter where you leave it at that point of time, ultimately it's going to center at the center of the capsular bag. So I don't think anyone has one golden tip that this is the best way to center the IOL. So
the other question was multifocal IOLs in a PCR. Yeah, if you have a PCR, then you have to manage the PCR well. If you do not have vitreous loss, then very important, before withdrawing your probe, you put in visco, see that the chamber is maintained so that your anterohyaloid does not rupture and you don't have a vitreous loss. Then you can go in, and if it's a central PCR, you can do a PCCCC with forceps. And if you have a nice PCCCC, then you can put the lens in the bag, and that should not be a problem. If your PCR is extended to the periphery, then it is not ideal to put a multifocal lens, because you can have a decentration. The lens can dislocate into the vitreous. You can have tilt. Tilt and decentration again are not very forgiving with multifocals. So you will have to put a lens in the sulcus, and it's not ideal to put a multifocal lens in the sulcus, especially if you're using a Restore or a panoptics lens, because the edges of the haptic are they're square edges and they're sharp, and they can cause iris chafing, pigment dispersion, recurrent uveitis. So it's better to use a 3-piece lens in the sulcus and do a optic capture in the capsulotomy, especially if your capsulotomy is small, like 5 millimeters or less, then you can do an optic capture, and that centers the lens very well. Yeah, of course, if the patient wants a multifocal, it's going to be difficult. You can do a monovision. If the other eye has not been operated, you can do a monovision. You'll also have to, if you're putting a lens in the sulcus, account for the effective lens position change. Otherwise, you'll get a myopic shift. The next question was management of post-op dysphotopsia. This is again, you may have done an excellent surgery, 6/6 uncorrected vision, refractive results are perfect, but patients come with saying that there's a shadow, there's something like blinders in the side, I see something in the side. So that's a problem. Now, there are a lot of theories of post-op dysphotopsia, and Jack Holliday has a very nice article on this. Sometimes you can have, this is basically negative dysphotopsia I'm talking about. So you can have negative dysphotopsia in one eye and not in the other eye. Various tricks have been tried, including positioning of the haptic, and then if you position it in the horizontal axis, the haptic, then usually dysphotopsia is less. But still, you can, even with that, you can get dysphotopsia. Dysphotopsia occurs because of total internal reflection, and then casting of the light coming from the temporal area undergoes total internal reflection, and the shadow is cast on the nasal retina. Now, if the nasal retina is more anterior, this is an anatomical variation that you have in patients, where the nasal retina is more anterior and then the shadow forms there, especially if the lens is placed more posteriorly. You don't get negative dysphotopsia in sulcus placed lenses. So one of the treatments of negative dysphotopsia is you can do optic capture, a reverse optic capture, where you actually push the lens anteriorly and capture it in the optic so that it is more anterior. You also have anti-dysphotopsia lenses like the Morcher lens, which was made by Dr. Mascott, and then you have the Femtis lens, and also we have also made a swivel haptic capsulotomy fixated lens, where you don't, if the lens is placed more anteriorly, then you don't have dysphotopsia. The other treatment for dysphotopsia is to put another piggyback lens in the sulcus. If you do that, you can either put like an ICL or a piggyback lens in the sulcus, plano or whatever power that has to be corrected. And this also relieves the negative dysphotopsia. For positive dysphotopsia with multifocals, again, you'll have to counsel the patient, more chair time, but eventually there's a neuroadaptation period. You'll have to see if the lens is centered well. You'll have to check for astigmatism. You'll have to check for any residual power. If there's residual power, then you'll have to take care of it. Astigmatism has to be managed either with corneal refractive procedure, or if the lens needs re-rotation, you'll have, rotation again, you'll have to rotate it and position it properly. So if you take care of all these things, then basically you can manage the positive dysphotopsia. If it's just the halos, then again, you will just have to handhold the patient, and over a period of time, in 3 to 6 months, most patients neuroadapt and they are more comfortable. One of the small tips is that when driving at night, they can put on the overhead light in the car. When they put on the overhead light in the car, then it's not so dark, so the pupil constricts a little bit, and then the dysphotopsia, the positive dysphotopsia and halos actually reduce. So you can ask the patient to do that, or you can prescribe medications like brimonidine, which constrict the pupil, or diluted pilocarpine, and for some time until the patient kind of adapts.
So I think Dr. Shrikanesh has covered it beautifully, everything. It is a written exam topic. So I think the only thing I would just add on is how you tell your patients what is happening and what you need to do. So I would say is whenever such things happen, always mention that since you have put a lens into your eye, the lens, the brain is getting adjusted to it. So the more important thing is for it to faster or speed up the process of adjusting, it's better not to focus on it. So if you just tell this one line where you tell the patient, do not keep looking at it, because the more you look at it, the brain might think that it is important and it'll start retaining it. So the more you look away, do your normal activities, do not focus on it, the neuroadaptation is a little more faster and patient also accept it. And usually once you just tell this one line, majority of the patients don't come back with this complaint. They'll be very happy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think we have answered most of the questions from the webcast. I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Savita.
So I would say wonderful surgeries by everyone, and doing surgeries normally in your OT and doing live surgery is completely different. So whatever you're seeing, there'll be another 20% more better, 100%.
Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of the interactive session. And I request our CMD, Dr. Shrikanesh, to present mementos as a token of appreciation to our panelists. Dr. Rohit Om Prakash. Dr. Krishna Prasad. Dr. Shail Vasavada. Dr. Naren Shetty. Mr. Sandeep Bothra, who's head of business unit of Alcon India. Please come on the stage, sir. Mr. Saurav Das. To present mementos to Sri Ganesh. Dr. Savio. Guests, esteemed panelists, faculty, wonderful audience, Alcon team, Skyline Audio Visuals for brilliant session. I wholeheartedly thank our IT team, biomedical team, OT staff, admin, and the entire Netradama staff for their participation.